I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is episode 20 of my series on the JFK assassination. At the end of episode 18 on our YouTube channel, some of you asked in your comments who bore responsibility for moving and placing the press vehicles to the far back of the presidential limousine on November 22, 1963. Well, that would be the Secret Service. And I communicated with Doug Horn about this situation. As many of you know, Doug served on the staff of the Assassination Records Review Board and is the author of a fantastic book. In fact, let me give credit where credit is due. Much, if not most, of what I've covered in this series is based on Horn's 5-volume book. It's called Inside the Assassination Records Review Board. And it is an absolutely watershed book in the Kennedy assassination. It is a remarkable achievement. Now, it's a tough read. I can't recommend it too highly, but it's tough. There's very technical sections on photography and X-ray technology and so forth. But anybody who reads all 5 volumes of this book, it's a virtual certainty that you'll finish with a conclusion without any doubt whatsoever that this was a fraudulent and deceptive autopsy that was conducted on the body of President Kennedy. So I asked Doug about this particular situation, and he said that the original plan that morning in Dallas was to put a flatbed trailer in front of the presidential limousine, obviously being pulled by some truck or vehicle, and that on that flatbed trailer was going to be all the professional photographers and filmmakers. So that if that vehicle had been there, obviously during the assassination, the whole area would have been covered with photographs and professional film and so forth. But because that was canceled at the last minute, and the reporters and the filmmakers were moved to cars, the whole flatbed trailer thing was canceled. They were put in cars further back, convertible vehicles. That meant that when the assassination happened, that only, pretty much for all practical purposes, only amateurs had the photographs and the film. Now, let me give you an interesting side story about this, about the Secret Service, that when the JFK Records Act was enacted, federal agencies were told that they could not destroy anything relating to the JFK assassination and had to preserve it and release it to the public. So when the ARRB comes into existence to enforce the JFK Records Act, one of the first things they did was contact the Secret Service because they wanted to study the protocols in the motorcades prior to the assassination, just to see if anything was anomalous or a change, like the photographers or, searching buildings or sealing windows and things like that. Well, the Secret Service told them that they didn't have those records. And the ARRB said, well, where are they? And they said, oh, we destroyed them. And well, it turned out that they destroyed them after the law was enacted that prohibited them from destroying them. And they didn't care. I mean, they knew that the ARRB couldn't do anything to them anyway. The director of the ARRB was furious. And, they had a big shouting match there, very angry. But, what could the ARRB, I guess they could have gone to a judge and cited them for contempt, which is really what they should have done. But this is the hubris of federal agencies sometimes. That you couldn't find a better example of obstruction of justice than that. But they didn't care. And, of course, nothing ever happened to them. And those records have now been destroyed forever. There was some reason why the Secret Service did not want the ARRB or the American people to study those records. Now, let's shift gears. At 1 o'clock p.m., or thereabouts, when President Kennedy was declared dead, two of the treating physicians at Parkland Hospital, as we've discussed in an earlier segment, had a press conference. And at that press conference, they talked about President Kennedy's wounds and why they were unable to save his life. And one of the wounds, as you'll recall, was a bullet-sized entry wound right here in the throat. That's where they did the tracheotomy. They cut a very thin little line and they put a breathing tube in. And then they had the massive exit-sized wound, the fist-sized wound, in the lower back of the skull and in the occipital region of the skull. Now, we've talked peripherally about the throat wound. You'll recall Colonel Fink was testifying in the Clay Shaw trial in 1969, 6 years after the assassination, and they finally drug out of him after hemming and hawing that somebody ordered him, when he started to dissect the neck wound, said, stay away from it, don't touch it, which of course reflects that there is some kind of power structure here that is managing or orchestrating and directing this autopsy. And then you'll recall that we mentioned Paul Mandel's article. He was the Life magazine reporter who wrote an article in Life magazine soon after the assassination that said that the Zapruder film showed President Kennedy turning and facing the school book depository when a shot rang out and hit him in the throat. Well, as it turned out, the Zapruder film showed no such thing. So clearly, though, the throat wound is causing people in this power structure, secret power structure, a lot of consternation as to how to handle it. Now, we're not going to examine that throat wound right now. I will say for now that that's the origin of the so-called magic bullet theory. But we're not going to examine it right now like we have the back of the head wound. Now, we've thoroughly analyzed that. You'll recall Sandra Spencer's testimony. She was the U.S. Navy petty officer who testified that the autopsy photographs that she developed showed that massive exit-sized wound. And when she looked at the official photograph showing the back of the head to be intact, she said, no, that's not the set that I developed. And then you've got the bystanders behind the limousine who were splattered with exit debris. You've got the Harper fragment, which was occipital bone, which is the lower back of the skull. You've got all of the treating physicians at Parkland immediately after the president was declared dead were unanimous about this large fist-sized wound. You got the two nurses at Parkland, Diana Bowrun and Audrey Bell. You've got Clint Hill, the Secret Service agent that's lying on the president in the limousine. He testified to this massive wound. And then you've got the two FBI agents, O'Neill and Sibbert, who said, yeah, massive wound back there. And one of them even said the official photograph looked doctored. And then you've got many of the participants at the Bethesda autopsy. You'll recall the House Select Committee lied about that and said, oh, they were all on the same page in denying that wound existed. And it turned out, as the ARRB discovered when their testimonies were released, that they said the exact opposite. They attested that there was this massive wound. And you'll recall even Commander Boswell, one of the three pathologists, that when he was drawing that diagram on the skull, showed that the wound extended all the way back into the back of President Kennedy's head. So the circumstantial evidence is conclusive, virtually conclusive, that this is a bogus photograph, and therefore you have a fraudulent autopsy. And of course, we've talked about the fraudulent and deceptive inventories and so forth. Well, the big question, though, is why? We haven't examined the why in all this. Why would the military do this? What's going on here? Why would the military, on the very day of the assassination of a U.S. president, say, let's conduct a fraudulent autopsy here? What would motivate them to do that? And so that why we still haven't addressed. So there's two big things we haven't addressed, the why and the throat wound. However, what we need to do now to understand these two big questions here is shift over to the assassination. Now, you'll recall at the beginning of the series, I said we're going to start with the autopsy because that's going to give you a better understanding of the assassination. But now what we need to do is shift to the assassination and the overall context of the assassination in order to understand these last two issues here, the why and the throat wound. So we studied the autopsy to better understand the assassination, but now we study the assassination to better understand the finishing part of the autopsy. It may sound complicated. I guarantee you it'll all be cleared up by the time we finish this series. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, Jacob, I've stuck with you here for 20 segments and I don't have any better understanding of the Kennedy assassination. But you do. You just may not realize you do. See, the way to look at the Kennedy assassination is like a jigsaw puzzle. Let's say a friend of yours gives you a jigsaw puzzle, a box full of 5,000 pieces. very tiny pieces, very complex puzzle. Half the pieces are green and half of them are blue, and some of them have little streaks of gray in them. Oh, and he lost the cover to the box, and he can't remember what the puzzle depicts. So you say, okay, so you start putting together a piece of the puzzle, and you put together a piece consisting of, let's say, 500 pieces. So then you get a brainstorm. You still don't know what it is, but it's mostly green and there's some little gray in it. Then you get a brainstorm. You think, okay, I'm going to look for the straight edge pieces so that I can build the frame of this puzzle. So you search through all the thousands of pieces and you find all the straight edge pieces, and lo and behold, you put together the frame. Well, then you get another brainstorm and you think, oh, I'll put this frame over this piece that I've put together. And so you do that, and man, it connects. So you see, you know that frame fits that particular puzzle. And so you proceed to finish the puzzle, except that you find at the end that your friend shorted you. That is missing like 600 pieces. And so there's holes and there are gaps. But notwithstanding that, you can still tell what the puzzle is. It's a puzzle of the Eiffel Tower. You got the green grass and the blue sky, and the gray was the Eiffel Tower. So there's holes, but you can tell what it is. Well, that's the way we're going to see the Kennedy assassination. By the time the series is over, we will have many, if not most, of the pieces together for this puzzle, but there's going to be some that are missing. For example, we will never know who fired that shot from the front that ended up with this massive exit wound in the back of President Kennedy's head. We will never know who fired the shot that it hit him, this bullet-sized entry wound in the throat. So those pieces will forever be missing. But when you look at the overall context of the puzzle and the assassination, you will know what happened. Now, what is the popular choice that the mainstream press always makes with respect to the Kennedy assassination? Here's what it is. I mean, let's assume that they're interviewing people in the street and they're giving their report. Ladies and gentlemen, we're doing a report on the Kennedy assassination, and we're asking people the question: did Lee Harvey Oswald act alone, or did he act in a conspiracy with someone, especially the communists? And so that's the choice, right? Lone nut. Was he a lone nut, or did he act in a conspiracy? And that's always the only choice that's presented. So let's take each of these choices and compare them with the piece of the puzzle we've put together here, which is the fraudulent autopsy that was conducted by the U.S. military. So let's take it from the perspective of the lone nut. Now, the reason I'm explaining this to you is to show you that you already have a better understanding of the assassination, even though you may not realize it. So let's take it from the perspective of the lone nut. So the lone nut says, Jacob, I guarantee you that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone nut assassin. That these conspiracy theorists are way out to left field. And there's no question that he operated alone. He was a communist, and the communists hate America. And they hated our president, and there's just no evidence of a conspiracy here, and all those shots rang out. Those are echoes, Jacob. And this was a little man that wanted to be a big man by killing a big man, and that's what Americans just can't face. All these conspiracy theorists can't face. And yeah, okay, he denied doing it, but that was part of his strategy, Jacob. There's no question. This was a lone nut assassination. Okay, Mr. Lone Nut Theorist, tell me how the U.S. military's fraudulent autopsy fits in with that theory. What do you mean, Jacob? What I mean is that on the very day of the assassination, the U.S. military conducts a fraudulent autopsy. Bogus photographs, bogus x-rays. Why would they do that? Why would they cover up for this lone nut, assassin of the president? Boy, Jacob, that's a real noodle scratcher. Well, you darn right it's a noodle scratcher. And I guarantee you can scratch your noodle till you're blue in the face, and you won't make it work. Well, then let's take it from the other side, the conspiracy theory side. Jacob, I guarantee this is a conspiracy. There's no question about it. Lee Harvey Oswald was living in the Soviet Union. He tried to defect over there. He was going to give the communist secrets as a committed communist. He was proselytizing for communism in New Orleans. and he went to Mexico City right before the assassination, and he met in the Cuban embassy, and he met the top assassin from the Soviet Union, and he was getting ready to go back to the Soviet Union after committing this assassination, and there's smoke behind that picket fence. You can see it in the photographs, and you can see people behind the picket fence, and there's no question, Jacob, this is a conspiracy. Okay. Mr. Conspiracy Theorist, tell me how a fraudulent autopsy fits within that. What are you talking about, Jacob? What I'm saying is, on the very day of the assassination, the U.S. military conducts a fraudulent autopsy with bogus x-rays, bogus photographs, trying to hide the fact that shots had been fired from the front. Why would they want to protect the communists? They hated communists. I mean, that was the whole point of the Cold War. Why would they want to help a conspiracy with this guy Oswald and his communist comrades? Boy, Jacob, that's a real noodle scratcher. You darn right it's a noodle scratcher. And I guarantee you can scratch your noodle till you're blue in the face and you will not be able to figure it out. You see, because they don't fit. Their two frames, the frames that the mainstream press presents to people, do not fit the piece of the puzzle we've put together here, which is a fraudulent autopsy conducted by the U.S. military. And so what we need to do is we need to explore the assassination in order to find the particular frame that fits, that connects to this piece of the autopsy, this piece of the puzzle, which is the fraudulent autopsy conducted on the body of President Kennedy by the U.S. military. And we're going to find that frame. I guarantee you, by the end of this series, you will see that the frame we find, the thesis we find, the proposition we find is going to connect onto this piece of the puzzle called the fraudulent autopsy conducted by the U.S. military. Now, if you want to get a review of what we've covered so far, you can get Horn's book, which is the watershed book, like I mentioned earlier. But if you want a synopsis of that book, my book, The Kennedy Autopsy, is a very short, easy to read synopsis of Horn's 5-volume book. It'll give you a nice summary of what we've covered so far. Now, if you want to get ahead, you want to do a little bit of homework, let me recommend to you some books. Horn did an ebook for us called JFK's War with the National Security Establishment, Why Kennedy Was Assassinated. Fantastic. Get you prepared for the next segment. I've written a book called Regime Change, the JFK Assassination. Another one, The Evil of the National Security State, I've written. There's another great book that Jefferson Morley, a former reporter for the Washington Post, did for us called CIA and JFK, The Secret Assassination Files. And then if you want to read the absolute perfect introduction to the things that we're going to be discussing in the next part of this series, I would highly recommend a book called JFK and the Unspeakable by James Douglas. So, that's a synopsis. Let me give one more credit where credit is due. You'll recall that I talked about the Clark panel, and we talked about the 2 meetings at the National Archives. Well, when I first discovered the Clark panel, I was just befuddled. It made no sense to me. What were they? What was going on here? Remember it was kept secret and so forth. Well, I finally found an article online called "The 5 Investigations into the JFK Assassination," which I highly recommend. Is by a researcher called Dr. Gary Aguilar. And from what I could tell, he was the only one who really put it together, the 3 meetings at the National Archives. There may be others, I didn't discover them, but Aguilar put everything in perspective with respect to those 3 meetings. And so I want to give credit, and I highly recommend reading his entire article. So that concludes this segment, and we'll shift into the assassination with episode 21.